MSNBC's Rachel Maddow blamed the massive anti-government and against President Maduro in Venezuela over Trump donations. If you don't believe she did this for real, check out the video below, where MSNBC's graphics banner reads "Unrest in Venezuela over Trump donations." As Hot Air points out, the relevant segment starts at 3:48, and the banner can be seen starting at 5:42. From Hot Air. I'm gonna guess her defense will be that, yes, the headline "Unrest in Venezuela over Trump donations" may have misled viewers about the true cause of this week's demonstrations demanding new elections amid the country's Chavismo-caused economic collapse, but Maddow herself didn't say anything wrong. She acknowledged the country's political and economic crisis. Her point is that it's inappropriate for a state-run oil company to be donating big bucks to Trump's inauguration when Venezuelans are starving in the streets, and that people there are undoubtedly pissed off about it. But as for the cause and effect between that and unrest, it's the damn Sheeran writer who screwed up. Judge for yourself. The relevant part begins at around 3:50, but the key line comes at 5:48 over scenes of crowds being tear-gassed during the protests, and now today Venezuelans are enraged anew by this brand new FEC filing from the White House. Hearing that and watching those images, if you were a dim-wit member of the resistance, you'd conclude that anger over the donations had driven people back out into the streets and that Venezuela was now melting down anew over the White House's petty greed. That's motivated reasoning at work. If you're watching this show, chances are you want to believe that Trump is the cause of all the world's problems, especially when the alternative is blaming Venezuela's socialist leader. So here's Maddow giving you reason to do so. Maduro warned a few days ago that he's planning to arm up to 400,000 Chavista militiamen with rifles to restore order, or whatever Orwellian euphemism he's using for what comes next. Hopefully Maddow can find a Steve Bannon or Carter Page angle somewhere in there to give her a reason to cover it.
On last night's show, we closed out the hour with a question. We raised a question about $107 million that appears to be sloshing around right now somewhere inside the Trump administration, with nobody accounting for it. These images here, these are images from the biggest presidential inauguration we ever had as a country. This was the first Obama inauguration in 2009. It was immense, biggest ever inauguration, biggest ever event of any kind in the city of Washington, D.C. To pull off that inauguration, the Obama Inaugural Committee raised more money than had ever been raised before for an inauguration. They raised tens of millions of dollars. They raised $53 million just for the inauguration. That broke all previous records for inauguration fundraising. And it broke those records by a lot. But you know what? It really was a big inauguration. And it did, in the end, cost about $50 million to put that on. And so they had to raise about $50 million to put that on. But let me say again, that was a really big, really unusually big inauguration. Let's just put that on can we put that up on the left side of the screen? All right. 2009, really big inauguration. Now, on the right side of your screen is an inauguration that was not nearly as big. And I don't say that to be mean. Also, size isn't everything. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad. I'm not trying to shut down the Park Service, right? but the Trump inauguration, which is the picture on the right, just as a matter of fact, it was much, much smaller than the one we saw in 2009. And it was of a different character, right? There were no mega concerts. There were no internationally known celebrity performers flying in and having hundreds of thousands of people turn out to see them. I mean, the entertainment for the Trump inauguration was like, middle school bands and baton twirlers, which is cool. There's nothing wrong with that. A, size isn't everything, and B, I like baton twirlers. But the Trump folks collected from donors $107 million to put on this inauguration. The one with the baton twirlers and the high school bands. And nobody at all lining whole big long stretches of the parade route during the inaugural parade. I mean, if this is what your inauguration looks like, what do you need $100 million for? $107 million. What do you need? Why do you need to more than double the record amount of money that was raised and spent on the biggest inauguration ever for an inauguration that was a fraction of that size? Now, this is not a good government issue, at least in terms of taxpayer money. This is not taxpayer money, not public money that we're talking about. This is money that the Trump folks took from donors specifically for the inauguration. They took $107 million. And that $107 million that they took in from donors, regardless of what needed to be spent for the inauguration in the end, that $107 million, it went somewhere. I mean, it obviously didn't go to this, right? That $107 million was not given by donors to the inauguration. It was not needed for the inauguration. They could have gold-plated every person at that inauguration and it still wouldn't have cost $107 million. But ask the next question, right? If that's not what donors' money went for, what did it go for? Because the donors didn't get their money back when it turned out to be kind of a cheap one. What were the donors donating to? What were they expecting to get for their money, given that it wasn't needed for the inauguration? Well, a couple of weeks ago, a reporter named Jake Horowitz posted a story at Mike.com about at least one thing that appears to have come out of that money. On February 8th, 2.5 weeks into the new administration, the White House hosted a meeting between several National Security Council officials and this guy. I think we've got a picture of him. Yeah. We now know, thanks to FEC filings released yesterday by the White House, that when this guy, this international investor, got that White House meeting with National Security Council officials on February 8th at the White House, we now know that his dad had just written over $600,000 in checks to fund the spectacularly overfunded inauguration. According to Jake Horowitz's reporting, the son got a meeting with National Security Council officials on February 8th. Then the following day, on February 9th, he was actually ushered into an even higher level meeting. Ushered into the top tier of the White House for a meeting personally with the president's top advisor, Steve Bannon. The purpose of those meetings, the National Security Council meeting and then the Steve Bannon meeting, the purpose of both of them was reportedly for him to present his detailed 10-point plan for changing U.S. foreign policy toward Venezuela, and specifically dropping U.S. sanctions toward that country. The guy reportedly put Venezuela's foreign minister on the phone with one of these National Security Council officials that he was meeting, put the foreign minister from Venezuela on the phone during the meeting, apparently just to show off that he could get the foreign minister on his cell phone meeting. Now, Venezuela doesn't get a ton of political coverage in the United States, but Venezuela is a country in intense turmoil right now. The sanctions that the U.S. put on Venezuela were put there in 2014 after 43 people got killed while participating in anti-government protests. Another 3 people got killed in anti-government protests just yesterday. There have been weeks and weeks and weeks of rioting and violent protests. And now today, Venezuelans are enraged anew by this brand new FEC filing from the White House, which shows that interesting thing about the guy who got the meeting with the NSC officials and with Steve Bannon. It also shows that while Venezuelans have been rioting in the streets, while there have been acute food shortages and medicine shortages in Venezuela, this is a country that should be a rich country, but people have literally been starving in Venezuela. Somehow in the midst of this incredible economic and political crisis in Venezuela, Venezuela's state-run oil company somewhere found $500,000 to donate to the very, very, very inexplicably overfunded Trump inauguration. Venezuela's state-run oil company gave him $500,000 too. So Venezuela's state-run oil company is dumping money into the Trump inauguration, $500,000. Meanwhile, another $500,000 plus was apparently enough to open up not just the White House, but the National Security Council, the freaking National Security Council, to a very well-connected donor and international investor who had a plan that he wanted to share on Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is in dire straits. It does not have the money to spare, and yet they inexplicably dumped $500,000 on Trump. And this Venezuela